Yeah, so thank you very much, Phil and Sarah, for inviting me to speak today. And so as Phil said, I hope we can dive into the world of phytoremediation. But before we do that, I'd like to kind of step back. In the introduction of my bio, you probably heard a lot of these buzzwords, and one of them is phytotechnologies. And so to put it simply, it's the strategic use of plants to solve environmental problems. And so it's kind of the biggest umbrella that we have in the world of restoring and reclaiming and remediating lands. And so if anyone is interested in more information about this, please visit phytosociety.org. This is the website for the International Phytotechnology Society. There are resources there, networks for people that you can contact, and then also information about conferences and stuff. And so when we talk about the strategic use of plants to clean up contaminated sites, I kind of like to think about it from the perspective of two different areas. First is the ecology. And so in this particular situation, we're strategically planting these trees to do things like serve as buffers so that we can eliminate any pollutants from getting into rivers, streams, lakes, et cetera, in addition to redirecting surface water, increasing tree canopy, carbon sequestration, and this list can go on and on. And in addition, thinking about it from the standpoint of redevelopment or in urban areas, how we are going to live in that space. So we like to call it oftentimes greening and cleaning. In addition, you can see that there are urban amenity plantings, and then these direct contact issues are typically, can typically be an issue, a problem for us with respect to contaminated soils, let's say. And so we need to do something with those soils so that people can use the space. And so the title of my presentation, the title of our presentation was Phytoremediation of Soils, et cetera, et cetera. And so for those of you who don't know what phytoremediation is, I've got this slide. It consists of 6 distinct processes, and it really just means using plants to clean up contamination from soil, water, sediment, sludge, any kind of medium. And when you think about phytoremediation, really there are 2 things that are really important. The first is the type of contaminant. So you'll see there in parentheses organics and inorganic. So organic contaminants, typically human-made. They have carbon chains, and interesting, they're very complex from a chemistry and biochemistry standpoint, but from a phytoremediation standpoint, actually easier to break down and remediate than the inorganics, which are heavy metals, salts. Think of the periodic table of elements. And so the first thing are the type of contaminant. The second thing are the tree or plant tissues that are doing the remediating. So we typically break them into 3 categories: roots, wood, and leaves. And so when you match those things together, the type of contaminant, the tissue it's in, you get these processes that are listed here. And I'm not going to go through each one, but for example, phytovolatilization, an organic contaminant might be translocated all the way up the tree. It gets broken down within the tree, and it's released through the leaves in an inert form. Another example would be rhizodegradation for the organics on the bottom right-hand corner there. And in that particular situation, what we have going is that this would be something like petroleum hydrocarbons, where the tree roots are creating an environment for microorganisms that are actually essentially eating the petroleum, and the trees are just kind of playing a passive role. They're not actually filtering or translocating. 3 traits of interest are the most important for phytoremediation. The first is elevated hydraulic control. So what we know is that in order for phytoremediation to be successful, we really need and want to and are continuing to learn about how trees use water And so, for example, there are some varieties in droughty conditions that can sustain high biomass. There are others that when they are given water in, say, a wastewater recycling program or a landfill leachate irrigation program, can use as much water as possible and therefore have a lot of biomass, which is the second trait of interest, fast growth and high productivity. And lastly, extensive root systems. You saw from that last slide with the processes that root systems are very important. So in order to maximize the effectiveness of phytoremediation, given the fact that the trees we use are typically poplars and willows, which have a lot of genetic diversity, and we have had a long history in the United States and throughout the world of breeding poplars and willows for fiber production and wood production, and we take that same bag of marbles and we test them extensively to figure out what specific varieties can be grown in the particular pollutant or contaminant or soil conditions. And so what we came up with in the early 2000s was a method called phytorecurrent selection. So you see in cycle 1 there are the triangles represent genotypes, so there are 200 genotypes. They're tested in the greenhouse for 14 days, very simple traits, survival, biomass. From those, we do another round of testing in cycle 2, ultimately ending up in cycle 4, which is in the field there you can see. And so the point here being subject the trees to contaminants or pollutants that they're going to be growing in, so that when we put something in the field, it has a higher probability of success than just saying, oh, we can buy these online, let's buy these online, let's plant them, and then we have no knowledge on what they're going to do when subjected to the pollutants. And so we call it the phytomatrix here, and this is all about matching the particular contaminant with the tree tissue and the genotype. So if it's a heavy metal, we would say, okay, let's use willows. And where is it going to put it? Is it going to put this particular contaminant into the roots or into the wood, and so on and so forth. And so if anyone is interested in phytorecurrent selection, some Forest Service researchers and I were working in New York City. So this was work that was led by Dr. Rich Hallett, and working on urban afforestation and restoration at Fresh Kills Landfill. This is a paper that describes the phytorecurrent selection process in addition to the landfill restoration and afforestation project in New York City. In addition, as part of the USDA, ARS, and Forest Service Regional Biomass Research Centers, we put together a special issue in bioenergy research that described ecosystem services and environmental technologies, the latter of which includes phytotechnologies, that were conducted throughout USDA. And so if you're interested in different projects and learning of the types of different phytotechnologies that are going on, these papers would be of interest to you. For those of you who are not familiar, I put this picture of a poplar planting. This is an 8-year-old planting in the Midwestern USA. You can see kind of grown like agronomic crops, very uniform growth in this particular situation. So this is kind of what we strive for, because then we can predict how these trees will perform. So as a function of years of partnerships and collaborations, we have kind of an ad hoc consortium that we call Great Lakes Phyto. It's a bunch of us, geneticists, physiologists, soil scientists, biochemists from industry, from the federal government, from universities, and the private sector that have been conducting phyto research within the Great Lakes region and throughout the world for decades now. And so this offers a very powerful piece for collaboration. We have recently begun collaborations with the Greening of Detroit, which you will hear about later. And so I just throw this out there. If anyone is interested and you have questions, let us know. And if you contact me and I don't know something, we have a very deep and rich network, of which in the last year we put together a couple advanced review articles. You can see here one relating one about positive water linkages and the other one about ecosystem services during phytoremediation. And I'll give you an example here. So this is a very busy slide, but if we disseminate it down, my take-home message for you all today is if you look at the column for system and the column for issue, the point being there are a lot of different phytotechnologies that we work on. So things like leachate fertigation. So this is using landfill leachate as irrigation and fertilization for the trees. Biochar for propagation is another one. So this it offers us an ability to increase the cation exchange capacity of soils so we can have better nutrient retention, and especially in the greenhouse and in a nursery. And then also things like riparian buffers and riparian stabilization. There's a group out of Iowa State University and the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry that work a lot on that. And then going to the right, you can see inorganics, organics again. I get a little specific with some of them with the petroleum hydrocarbons, TCE, PCE. But point being, these poplars and willows we use have been applied or can be applied to multiple applications. So whether you're in urban areas or rural areas, whether it's a landfill, a vacant lot, a brownfield, our base system of applying that phytorecurrent selection and trying to figure out that phytomatrix for your particular situation is very functional and what we strive to do. So this is an example of a phytoremediation system in northern Wisconsin. This is, these are hybrid poplars at 8 years. This is a landfill leachate irrigation program where we use the irrigation, the leachate as irrigation and fertilization. The primary constituents in the leachate in this particular situation were salts, so sodium chloride, some boron, and a little bit of selenium. And so we irrigated them on a weekly basis, and you can see very nice, lush green trees. This is a totally different type of application here. This is fiber cake recycling at our county landfill, and the previous landfill director was working with a paper company in town, and they have what's called fiber cake. It's essentially a byproduct of container board production. They bring the fiber cake out to the landfill, spread it on asphalt pads. Then with precipitation, there is leachate that comes off, goes into a pond, and they use the water in that pond as irrigation for the trees. You can see at 12.5 years, the trees are ginormous, especially for the climate and number of growing degree days that we have here in northern Wisconsin. The posts that you see there are about 9 feet tall. And then the last example that I'm going to show you here is an industrial production facility in the Midwest that has heavy concentrations of salts, metals, nitrates in the soil. These trees are buffering a river behind it, and so these trees are 11 years old there. You can kind of see an agroforestry system really with some nice understory. And that brings us to today and what Phil was talking about with respect to phytoremediation at landfills in the Great Lakes region. I've been very fortunate to have the support of Phil and Sheila Johnson, who Phil was a focus area lead, and now Sheila Johnson's a focus area lead. We also have wonderful people within the Forest Service, Hobie Perry with the Northern Research Station, and Nick Vrevich is our Forest Service program, GLRI program manager, and they've been very supportive of this landfill project that Phil was mentioning before. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with the GLRI program, within the second action plan, there were 5 focus areas, and we fall under focus area number 3, which is non-point source pollution impacts on nearshore health. And so for us, what this means is kind of a two-pronged approach. Number 1, to reduce runoff from these landfills that go into creeks, rivers, streams, and into, essentially, ultimately into the Great Lakes. and secondly, to see if we can use phytoremediation to clean any contamination that might come from that runoff. And so in response to this, since 2016, we have planted over 20,000 trees in 16 different phytoremediation buffer systems at the 10 sites that you can see on this figure. Rhinelander is where I'm located and where the Institute for Applied Ecosystem Studies is located. All of the circles in smaller text are where we have installations. At some of them we basically have 1 to 3 phytobuffer installations at each one of these sites. And so it has been a major collaborative effort, as I mentioned before, kind of a public-private academic partnership, and these are just examples of some of the partners that have been involved with us from the beginning. And so now I want to just show you at how we kind of approach these landfills. And so this is kind of a typical situation. All of our plantings are on either at closed landfills or closed sections of active landfills. So for those of you who aren't familiar with landfills, closed means it has been, it is not accepting any more waste, and it is regulated by the regulatory body, in this particular situation, the Wisconsin DNR. And so there's a lot of monitoring that goes on. Nothing new is brought there, but given precipitation and stuff, you still have potential runoff in addition to below ground infiltration and movement of water. And so you can see in this particular situation, this river that's right next to the landfill. And so our objective is to plant trees in between what's called the limits of historic waste, so where the waste ends and where that water begins. And in doing so, at our landfills, we have these different phytotechnologies that I was talking about before. So we've talked about phytoremediation, phytostabilization, and phytovolatilization. We've also talked about runoff reduction. There's and then this water issue, right? And so I talked about leachate irrigation, but there's also wastewater recycling, stormwater management, groundwater recycling, and we don't necessarily have each one of these phytotechnologies at every landfill, but across that network that you saw in the previous slide, we are doing all of these things. So this is an example of a landfill in southeastern Wisconsin in June of 2018, and just kind of focus in on the trees. And the next picture that I show you is going to be 1 month later, just to give you an example of how fast these things are really growing. So there's actually a person right here behind that tree. It's hard to see in the picture, but I'll go back so you can see just real phenomenal growth, really. And that's what we're looking for, because with that growth, essentially we get a bigger straw, which means we can potentially suck more contaminants out of the soil, or buffer the runoff that might be coming off of that hill. This is another example. You can see an active part of the landfill in the background. Up here, you can see a constructed wetland, and then our trees. To the back, kind of where the arrow is pointing, is the closed landfill. So everything's pretty much running towards this constructed wetland. And just kind of another pictorial approach here is August of 2017. So 13 months later, you can kind of see the size of the trees there. So just where we're going with all of this. At this point, we're looking at what are called genotype bioenvironment interactions. So using the phytorecurrent selection to try and identify what specific species and what varieties within those species will grow at these particular sites, and be able to reduce the runoff or use water or clean the contamination in the soils, and so on and so forth. And in thinking about that, it's all about growth and physiology, so things like sap flow and water usage and water use efficiency and then the typical suite of physiological parameters, transpiration, photosynthesis, such, and so on and so forth. In addition to tree health, we have some collaborators at the Missouri University of Science and Technology that are working on using drones and having LiDAR and RGB cameras and everything set up so that we can assess the health of these trees from the air. And in addition, a collaborator, Dr. Joel Birkin from Missouri S&T, has patented a technology called phytoforensics. So you core older trees like those two poplars that are in the background, and you can map groundwater contamination plumes, which is really cool. And then in addition, long-term measurements, which we will continue to do. So basically what we're trying to do is go from this kind of degraded look to this clean and like I said before, cleaning and greening, and then also adding in the urban environment. And so with that, I'd just like to once again highlight the fact that there's a lot of collaboration potential if someone is interested, whether it's phytotechnologies, ecosystem services, green infrastructure, pretty much anything related to phytoremediation. So I will pass the baton to Fai and Sam from the Greening of Detroit, who will talk to you about some specific dendroremediation sites they have, in addition to the collaboration that we are developing. Thank you.